Hello and welcome back to another VMK in the Caligari series. In this video, I'll show you how to use the user interface inside Caligari trueSpace. If you're following along with Caligari GameSpace Lite, the interface should look very similar. There will be some features which GameSpace does not have. However, I'll try to avoid using these features so that you can follow along fully within GameSpace Lite. Once you start GameSpace or trueSpace, you'll notice one thing immediately. There is no title bar at the very top of the application. You just have a bunch of buttons. In the middle of the screen, you have the scene view. This is where you'll be creating your 3D models. Then you have some more buttons along the side, more buttons along the bottom, and then look it down here, more buttons. And if you look closely, you'll notice there's a title bar on the very bottom of the application. This is unique to trueSpace. It doesn't have a title bar at the top for like maximizing, minimizing, and all that other stuff. All of that is located in the bottom section of the window. Every single functionality within trueSpace can be done by clicking on a button. That's the whole premise of trueSpace. You don't need to type in any commands to create boxes, spheres, texture, anything. Everything is done completely using the mouse and clicking on buttons. So in this video, I'm going to sort of give you a quick overview of where to find certain things inside the user interface. You'll notice that the buttons are sort of categorized into groups. Let's begin with the category of buttons located up here. These are referred to as the render settings. Using these buttons, you can select how you're going to render things. You can choose how much filtering you apply to rendering, what color the background is of the render, and things like this. Along the top here, you find a set of buttons which are mainly used for animation. So you can use these buttons here to record animations. There's some buttons up here to create skeletal structures within your models and things like that. There's a hidden set of navigation buttons located here. If you just highlight over top of that little square, a set of buttons will appear. Use these first three buttons to move the camera in the world, and then you use these following buttons here to move your objects in the world. There's a couple other buttons here to navigate through hierarchies that you create inside your 3D model. I'll talk about this a little bit later. Located along the side here, we have layers. So you can structure things inside your 3D model so that you place, for instance, arms in one layer, legs in another layer, and a body in a third layer. And then by turning these layers on and off, you can simplify what you see on the screen so that you don't clutter your workspace. Down here along the side, you'll find what are called the Caligari libraries. Here you'll be able to pick different kinds of color shaders, go through your object library. There's also primitives, scenes, things like that. Just basically a collection of different libraries. Located along the bottom here are all the tools that you use to model with. You have tools to create objects, you have tools to create light sources and cameras, and then a bunch of other manipulation tools here. Located near the back end here are ways to paint your model as well as texture it. And then there's some other features here which I won't talk about in detail because these are specifically just for trueSpace and not for GameSpace. These will allow you to add extensions into trueSpace, do facial animations, and things like that. Down here in this section, you will find the world tools. So you use these tools to select objects, select faces, or select edges, and then there's ways to create a new scene, create hierarchies, and there's a help in here as well. Located on the bottom, right beside the status bar, ways to render the objects. We have different views we can select, and we have constraints, so we can constrain motions to X, Y, or the Z axis. The other thing is we have this manipulator here in the bottom right hand corner. Using this manipulator, you can change how the view looks. You'll notice that with all these buttons, there's a little bar located beside the sets of buttons. Here there's a bar that has little minuses beside it. Here there's just a little square box that opens up when you navigate over top of it. Each of these, what you can do is you can click and drag, and you'll actually move that whole bar with all the buttons on it. So you can place it wherever you like. And as a matter of fact, if you go and drag it right to the side of the screen, it'll flip, so it'll change directions. This is handy if you want to change the way that your workspace looks. So I'm going to go and put this back to where it was. The other thing you can do is you can click on that bar with your button. Clicking once will open up all of the buttons that are hidden underneath there. Clicking on it again and the bar disappears, leaving only a little square, which when you highlight over top of it, the bar opens up. You can then click on that bar one more time and it'll put it back to how it was originally. The way I like to work is I like to open up this navigation bar and I like to leave it open, just because I find it handy to know which setting I have currently selected. If you find that there's a bunch of buttons you're not using very frequently, you can just go and click on the bar a couple times until it disappears, and then it'll give you more real estate to look at. Now let's take a closer look at some of the buttons. You'll notice some of the buttons have a little red triangle in the top right hand corner, whereas other buttons have a blue triangle located in the top left hand corner. What do these mean? Well, if you right click on any button that has a red triangle in the top right hand corner, it will open up another set of buttons. And you can use these buttons to customize how this specific tool works. And I'll talk about these once we start using the tools. If you see a button with a triangle in the top left hand corner, that means there's more buttons located underneath this one. If you navigate over top of one of these buttons with the blue triangle, click and hold your mouse and then wait a second, you'll notice a bar opens up. All of these ones here also have a blue triangle in the top left hand corner. So if I stop my motion, wait, it'll open up another set of buttons. Now on GameSpace Lite you won't have these extra buttons because GameSpace Lite only supports polygon shapes. The blue ones represent NURB shapes and the green ones represent metaball shapes. I'm not going to talk about these kinds of shapes. We'll only be using the polygon primitives. Anytime you place the cursor over top of a button, down here in the status bar, where I'm pointing to right now, you'll notice there'll be a little tooltip showing what the current button is that you have highlighted over top of. This is helpful because it also gives you hints on how to use that specific button once you actually click on the button. So for instance, if I click on the sphere, it says left click to define primitive position, right click to leave tool. So this tells me how to specifically use the sphere tool to create a sphere on the screen. I'm just going to go and click on the object selection tool here, which is the little arrow. A few other settings I want to point out to you. If you click on File, you'll find there's a Preferences option. Inside here, you have a bunch of checkboxes which you can use to turn things on and off. If you can't get used to the title bar being located at the very bottom of the screen, you can go and click on Top Menu, and this will move the status bar as well as the menu bar located to the top of the screen. All the other options are pretty self-explanatory. If we need to go and change something specific, I'll go and explain what it does in detail a little bit later. Make sure you do have 3D controls turned on. If you turn this off, you'll notice that the navigator located in the bottom right hand corner disappears and you can't use it anymore. The only way to navigate through your scene now is by using these buttons up here. However, every now and again it is useful to use that 3D control, so make sure you have 3D controls turned on. The other thing which we'll do, actually let me go and put the top menu back to the bottom because I've gotten used to it being located at the bottom. Other options you can find under the display options here in the file menu. Here you'll find a bunch of options that you can use to color what you have on the screen. So when you make a selection, you'll notice it will be highlighted with a specific color. You can change the color of the scene, you can change the texture resolution, and things like that. If we need to change some settings in here, I'll go and explain how to change them, but I just want to make sure that you're aware that there are some display options located underneath the file menu here. One thing that you may experience when working with trueSpace is that the video response is slow. This may happen because of certain video cards. You can play around with the video settings inside trueSpace by clicking on this icon located down here. By default, it uses the DirectX renderer to render everything on the screen. If you're having difficulties, I recommend you go click, hold your left mouse button, drag upwards, and select OpenGL. Now everything's being rendered using OpenGL instead. By selecting OpenGL or DirectX, you may find a performance difference depending on your video card. I'll just leave it at OpenGL for now. The last thing I wanted to discuss is this navigator here. How do we use this? Well, there's actually a lot of control wrapped up into this little navigator. By clicking on this portion of the navigator and holding the left mouse button, you can rotate around in the world, as shown here. On clicking on this triangular portion here and holding the button, you can sort of slide around in the XY direction. If you hold the right mouse button and drag, you're actually moving up and down in the scene. Clicking and holding on this lets you move around in the YZ direction. Clicking on this one here lets you move in the XZ direction. Again, you can figure out which way you're going to move before you actually move your mouse just by reading what it says here in the status bar. If you want to roll about a specific axis, you can click and drag on any of these bars. If you click and drag on this one, you'll notice that I'm sort of doing a pitching motion. This one here gives me a yaw kind of motion, and this one here gives me a roll motion. If you end up placing your view into some obscure point of view that you don't like, you can hit the tilde sign on your keyboard and it will reset the view to the default settings. The tilde is located to the left of the number 1 on your keyboard. This is a hotkey that's created in trueSpace for you to reset the scene to its default settings. You can also use the end tips of these bars here to translate either up and down or along one of these axes. This one here actually zooms in and out. Alright, so that's basically where you'll find all the buttons, how to move the manipulators around, and how to sort of navigate in your scene. In the next video, I'll show you how to set up your workspace to fit with the workflow that I'm going to be using for the VMKs that are shown in the series.